I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and welcome to night 8 of the 2023 ChemKnits Chanukah special. Every night of Chanukah this year, I've released a new yarn dyeing video featuring new colors and techniques, but the series doesn't actually end tonight. There are some bonus videos for this series. Tonight, my goal is to dye a soft and speckled colorway. I want to create a tonal and then layer on some subtle countertop speckles on top of that. I really wanted to create a soft lavender base for this colorway, and that got me thinking about my lilac trees. And so I decided to pull colors that fit with me looking at these beautiful blossoms. For our palette today, the main color is going to be lilac, and my plan is to do this a little bit on the more pastel side, but we might have some differences in our minis because I might edit and adjust the amount of dye that we're using for that base tonal layer. And then for our speckles, I'm thinking I want some delphinium blue. That's going to bring in some blues and a little bit of pinks, sort of like the center. Sage leaf also breaks. It might bring in a little bit of yellow in addition to some blues and greens. Forest green is mostly going to be a deep tealish green. Occasionally it has a bright green speckle, but that'll work in well with these two colors that we know definitely break. And then some pecan brown for sort of those twigs. Someday I'm going to dye some yarn with my lilac, like the twigs. Apparently you can get some cool colors, but I have to trim them back all the time because my lilac bushes are massive, but I digress. Let's go start dissolving our dye. I put on my PPE, a deluxe rubber respirator mask with P100 filters, safety glasses, and gloves, and measured out 1 gram of our lilac dye. I dissolved this 1 gram of dye powder in some hot tap water, not worrying about the volume at this stage. If I like the ratio of dye that I'm going to be using for this first tonal layer, then I'll go ahead and make up a dye stock because I'll know about how much dye I will need. But for this first one, we're just going to measure out the dye that I want. My scale was behaving a little bit finicky. That was fairly odd. All right, I've got our gram of lilac dye, and I'm adding it to a kettle that has 32 cups of water. I'm going to rinse this out. Okay, and we're going to add some acid. Okay, 32 cups of water. I want 2 tablespoons of white vinegar per 8 cups of water, so 8 tablespoons of vinegar. Probably could have used just a 1/4 cup too. 3, 4, 5. And because people sometimes ask, this is 5% white vinegar. And I'm going to stir this up. All right, and we're gonna come over with 300 grams of dry yarn. And we're gonna add this in. These are 10 gram mini skeins of Wool to Dye Forest Platinum Sock. Although I will also be dyeing Platinum DK today as well. And you'll notice from me adding the yarn in and raising it up, we're getting a lot of variation of color in here. So we have both a moderate acid level, and we're starting with the yarn dry. And so that will give us, we're not exactly dip dyeing, but just to show you, you can see we've got light and darker patches here. So one of the pigments in here struck pretty quickly. All right, I am going to turn on a timer for, I guess I did 9 minutes, 9 to 10 minutes, and we'll see if all the color absorbs. Lilac is a pre-metallized dye, which means that it can strike a lot faster, which is something that we saw here. If I wanted the color to be more even, I would have started cold with no acid and then either brought the heat up slowly or the acid up slowly to help get better coverage. But when you're dealing with a small amount of dye, you are more likely to get uneven coverage. And I mean, that's sort of what I wanted today. I wanted that tonal variation in here, which again is why I started dry, because with the dry yarn, it's gonna soak up liquid unevenly and therefore soak up the dye unevenly. And so all those things kind of contribute. As for the depth of shade, the amount of color we have on the yarn, I think in my head I had something a little bit lighter in mind, but we'll see what happens when more of the color in the dye bath absorbs, because I like what we have there, and so therefore I might continue with these proportions. Because with 1 gram of dye and 300 grams of yarn, we have a total depth of shade of 0.33%, if you're curious. And so as a color that is more, you'd think of as more of a pastel, this does have a fair amount of pigment, and so I'm very happy with what we're seeing. This color here is making me excited to do another tonals video. It's been a long time since I've done a video that has literally just been about making tonals and letting them have tonal variation versus worrying about the color being super even. Yeah, in those 10 minutes, almost all of the color has cleared. But we can check that with a yarn mop because I'm curious, and because then it'll add some acid to our yarn mop for later. But I'm gonna set these aside to cool. Do I see some yellow in there? This is a skein of wool to dye forrest Krypton, and adding her in, I'm not seeing any pigment. I would say that this dye bath is really clear, because sometimes something might look relatively clear. I don't know if there's like a hint of yellow, but I would call this fairly clear. Sometimes you can, when you go in, you can see like a bare hint of something, which I am not seeing here today. But Krypton is also 75% superwash merino wool, 25% nylon. The main difference is it's 3 plies, and it might have higher quality merino maybe. Let's prep for more tonals. I have another 4 batches of the tonal round I need to do. So I decided to make a 500 milliliter 1% dye stock of lilac. And therefore I measured out 5 grams of lilac and dissolved it in a total volume of 500 milliliters. And now I can use 100 milliliters of this mixture at a time to have 1 gram of dye go into our dye bath for 300 grams of yarn. And if you're curious how I'm going to do all these batches when I'm only dyeing 130 mini skeins, I'm going to dye 2 full skeins of Knit Pick Stroll, also 75% superwash merino wool, 25% nylon, in one of the batches. So then we'll have some full skeins in this colorway as well. When doing the tonals, I noticed on the stroll that the color seemed to break a little bit, giving us some purple and some more pink notes, which honestly surprised me because stroll and platinum, yes, they're milled at separate mills, but they have the same fiber content and yardage. And so I don't know if it's about how I added the yarn in or what, but that did surprise me a little bit. Of course, when you're using the same pot over and over, and as we remove volume of liquid, you notice that I did add some water and more vinegar at one point. The pH is changing, so things could behave slightly differently because it's not consistent, because I'm not adding acid each time I'm adding liquid, but I'm not adding that much liquid, so I don't think it would be a huge deal. But I was very curious to see if I would see these hints of pink, more pink tones on subsequent batches as well. Now we have about 78 milliliters of our lilac dye that we mixed. And we're gonna go ahead and leave none of this behind. Now, why are there 78 milliliters left instead of 100? Well, there were at least a couple drips and spills. There's a margin of error whenever I was using a graduated measuring cup to measure the volume. So yeah, things can come up. But to this dye, we're gonna add that skein of Krypton that didn't get any color before. And so we're gonna add this in and leave this in here, I guess probably just 10 minutes like everything else. But anyway, this was just a moment for me to point out that whenever you're making a dye stock and you know you're gonna need a certain amount of dye, it's best to over measure and over make that stock, because that way you have plenty and you don't find that you're short before your last batch. And besides, you can do a fun leave no dye behind skein with whatever is left. Lilac is such a pretty color. Why don't I use this more? Oh my goodness. All right, I see a hint of some like blue or gray left in the water. There, and if you're curious, here we have the yarn mop that has over double the amount of dye as our main colorways.
All right, I'm masked up again to get our speckles ready. So in each of these little mini spice jars, I have 1 teaspoon of a finely milled citric acid powder. And now I'm going to use these tiny scoops, which I think are 1/64 of a teaspoon. And I'm going to add 3 scoops. Hopefully this isn't going to be too much. Of sage leaf, and carefully, we'll be able to shake it in a little bit, but for now we're going to carefully stir this up. The nice thing about using these little scoops to measure, because sometimes I just sort of wing it with the dye powder, but the nice thing about using these little scoops is then I can re-measure the dye. Now as for the little scoop, I'm just kind of pop it on the yarn mop. I'm going to add a lid, and then I can shake the little jar. And so some of the dye is coating the side of the jar. That's okay, but we will continue with these other colors.
For the remaining 3 colors, I used 3 scoops of the Delphinium blue powder and then 2 scoops each of the forest green and pecan brown, because those colors have a lot more pigment in them per volume of dry dye powder. Sometimes when I'm mixing dye with citric acid for speckling, I wing it. But the perk of measuring things out here today is that I can easily make more and have consistency of the ratio of dye to citric acid if I run out and need more to continue on with my speckling.
I'm coming over with 200 grams of yarn that we dyed before, and I am going to spread it out sort of as much as I can. Since we're dealing with mini skeins, it's a lot easier to spread things out because we have 10, like these are bundles of 10 different 10-gram minis, so there are just differences, and as we spread, we should be able to access all of the yarn a little bit easier than a full skein, which has a bundle sort of trapped like this, so there's yarn like in the inside of the bundle and it can't move freely as well. And now I should do this just over here. I'm removing the lids, hopefully not making a mess. I should be just taking these lids off over the yarn mops. As you can see how we have some powder that has come up. But all of these colors should show up on our yarn. And so I'm going to come in and kind of go through, not going too heavy. And I'm going to do it twice with each color, but not necessarily in the same place each time. And you know, because then when we flip, I'll just sort of mix up the pattern. Because I do plan to flip the yarn. Uh-oh. I did not keep track well of what I've used. I need to have a better system. But I don't think I used brown yet. And let's go here. I think that that's fine. These are going to be subtle. Okay, I'm going to pick up the yarn and flip it over. And so we will get some color transfer because you can see there's some dye sort of left on the counter. We will have some transfer from there up onto this layer, but I'm trying really hard to not rub it because we want sort of those colors to arrive. We don't want them to have too big of an impact. Okay, here we go. I think this is our sage leaf. Just sprinkling it. And this time I'm making sure that I put it somewhere where I know that I've already used the color. The forest green is quite pigmented. Funny that the pecan brown I think this one is the pecan brown. Does not look like very much yet. Or did I already use the brown? Maybe this is the sage. As I said, it's really, really hard to tell when you're just dealing with the powder in dry form. Just in case, it's okay if we do a tiny bit more on them as well. Okay, see the brown? Do I see who you are? No. Okay, I'm gonna come in here one more time. Okay, so the forest green absolutely is making a big, big impact. That I can see from far away. Yes, you could see that up there. The other colors, oh, I see the pecan brown, that's nice and subtle. Okay, I see the other colors. Everything looks good. But what I'm gonna do now is pick up our yarn. And it's funny, I see a bigger impact from the pecan and forest green and a lesser impact from those other colors. But I've put that 200 grams of yarn into the steamer basket, and now I'm coming over with the yarn mop to clean the counter before I go and get 200 grams more yarn, because I need to steam set the yarn for 30 minutes, but we may as well wait until we have 400 grams of yarn in the pot, or in the steamer basket, because ultimately this is relatively fast.
Before bringing the tonal yarn onto the countertop, I did make sure to squeeze out most of the water, so that way it was only a little bit damp. This will help keep the colors from spreading out a ton, so that way we can get sharp speckles. One of the nice things about using these little spice jars for the speckling versus using my gloved fingertips, taking a pinch of the powder and speckling on that way, is that I can quickly switch between the different colors, and I'm not worrying about adding some of one color to another or anything like that. This overall speckling pattern is similar to the Eevee colorway I did as part of the Spring Mini Skein mini-series this year, where instead of using each of the colors really all over the yarn, I am randomly placing it in a couple sections on one side, then a couple sections on the other. And so we'll have pops of these colors, and yes, they will still be somewhat all over, but it'll still be a little random, and have it be a speckled colorway without being a really heavy speckled colorway. It's time to remove the yarn from the dye bath, and ooh, we see that forest green. See, I see the pecan brown. Ooh, I see some of the delphinium blue. It's very subtle. And I don't know about the sage leaf. It's in there. I see some yellows that I know come from it. But I think the sage leaf is going to be a lot like the forest green. But it's pretty and subtle and just adds a little bit of some dimension to our otherwise very purple colorway. Yeah, there you can really see that delphinium blue. I think that the sage leaf is the more broken green. Probably didn't need both, but sometimes you don't know how colors will behave. Ooh, that blue. So now I'm gonna let this yarn cool completely so then we can wash it. Now I'm gonna dye the full skeins of yarn, and there are some differences here because, as I mentioned, with the mini skeins, with the bundle mini skeins, I can really easily spread it out really far. So even though the skeins are overall shorter, I'm able to get more surface area from just the two flips. Whereas with the full skeins, I can still try to spread it out a lot, but after doing one side and then the other, I'm gonna wanna open it up and sort of do a third round just to see if there's more coverage I want, to make sure I don't have all of the same yarn sort of in the center all at the same time. And as for the more pink that I'm seeing here, I think that that pink is also present on the mini skeins that were in that particular round. I have a feeling I added the yarn in quickly, but didn't move it as much, so we didn't get as much coverage overall of the bluer, more purple pigments. And so that's why I'm seeing more of a pastel pink here versus some of the other batches that I dyed. So that's not something that I'm overall worried about, but it's always worth noticing when I observe something different in one of these videos. And then I I carried on speckling onto our mini skeins using all 4 colors. I did need to refill the jars once, so it was a good thing that I kept track of the recipe. I steam set 400 grams of yarn at a time for 30 minutes in my steamer basket, and our yarn mop was getting quite a workout. The base of this yarn mop is a lot deeper, but because I'm rubbing it on the counter, we're not getting sharp speckles, we're getting larger, more patches of color on here.
Here is our yarn mop. The colors in it are super subtle and very pretty. I'm gonna go steam set this also for 30 minutes. But we do have some leftover dyes to use up.
I grabbed a second skein of Krypton and just quickly wet it in some water. And then run over these leftover dyes and went to town, speckling really heavily, trying to get a lot of coverage on this yarn to use up these leftover dyes. I know that ultimately there's not that much pigment, but I thought that this would be fun and really, really pretty. Once I was done, I steam set the yarn for 30 minutes. And I didn't worry about adding acid to the yarn because we have citric acid in with the dyes, and so that's plenty of acid. Let's wash our yarn. You know, given that I flip things inside out, I'm curious if I'll find areas that feel like they don't have a lot of color. But the goal is for the speckles to be subtle. They feel fairly dark there because the patches are all in one place. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what things look like once the yarn is dry. Ooh, but I love what it did to our tonal. Ooh, so many favorites today. All right, I'm gonna add some dish soap. And this time the way I'm doing that is just by rinsing the outside of the soap container. Because sometimes you need to pour it in, sometimes you don't. But I'm fairly optimistic that we're not gonna see any color bleeding. And we don't. So I'm gonna finish rinsing out the soap. Oh, so pretty. And then put the yarn through my spin dryer. I use a spin dryer just to remove some of the excess liquid. It helps the yarn dry faster, and without the liquid weighing it down, it dries a little fluffier too. The model that I use is discontinued, but I have a laundry alternative, Nina Soft, that the company actually gave me many years ago. But anyway, that's the one that I have. But a lot of other people use a lot of other different brands. It just, I never realized how much I would use it, and it's a permanent fixture in my kitchen. But anyway, let's go look at the dry yarn. Here are a bunch of the mini skeins that we kettle dyed and then speckled. I know we used 4 different colors of speckles, but I think I might need to fight to find the different greens. We can see our pecan brown, and I mean, I definitely see some greens that have some more yellow breaking and some greens that don't. I think ultimately with speckling and with the variation of purple on the bottom, some of those feel very, very similar and very close to one another. But I cannot pinpoint the difference right now looking at the yarn. If we look in these more blue areas, we do see the occasional red speck from this color breaking. It's super subtle. Sometimes it might be a little larger, and other times it's just really, really subtle around the other speckles. I really love the way that you look at this and you're like, oh, this is purple yarn. And then you look closer and you're like, ooh, there's hints of like green and blue and brown. It's really fun. And I've already twisted some up and I can't wait to show you that. But first, let's compare some mini skeins to the full skeins. Here we have 2 mini skein bundles and then 2 full skein bundles. Now right now, it looks like we have one that's much darker than the other, but I think that's part of the way that it's laid out. If I were to, well, flipping it didn't really change. Actually, maybe one is a fair amount lighter than the other. You know, that happens even in one kettle. I guess this one sucked up a little bit more dye, so there's some variation there. Looking at the full skeins, you might say there's some fairly large areas where I speckled. And while I think that this is true compared to some of our minis, this one seems to have extra subtle patches of speckles. I was absolutely more heavy-handed in some other batches of minis. So far in each of the individual mini skeins I've looked at, I've ultimately been able to find all of the colors on each of the skeins. Yes, in here, some of those browns are a lot more subtle than they are here. These are each from those bundles I showed with the full skeins, but ultimately, all the colors so far seem to be present. But if you opened up a ChemKnits Chanukah sampler, let me know if you don't find brown or you don't find the blue on your mini. I'm curious. And here are those exact same two minis twisted up. I don't always show the exact mini laid flat without its bundle and then that same one twisted up, but I thought it was worth showing right here. And now our full skeins are here with us too. It's sometimes really silly to say things are different dye lots when they're literally dyed at the same time in the same kennel, like these two full skeins are, but depending on the technique and the pigments, if things go into the water a little bit unevenly, you can end up with a situation where one has a lot more pigment than the other. And then especially when you're doing random speckles, one of them could, I mean, in theory, they should have approximately the same amount of brown, etc., but one of them could have more than the other. And so these two likely would feel quite different. And so I would 100% recommend that you alternate skeins when you're going to blend them, because I think you could get something that feels, although subtle, quite different, because this one just has a lot more of that dark purple. Here I have the minis from two different bundles twisted, and the minis I had showed in the previous clip aren't included in here. This was one set of 10 and this was one set of 10. And the main thing I want to point out here is just the consistency on this particular bundle felt very consistent. I feel a similar amount of the super pastel and deeper patches of purple across the board. And I didn't intentionally try to arrange things where it felt darker to lightest, but there are some in this particular DK bundle. That one feels a little bit darker. This one feels a little bit lighter. And I don't think that that's because this is DK, this is fingering. It just happens to be where that particular bundle was when it was going into the batch. Maybe one of the mini skeins hit the water a little later. And so that's just something that can be a factor. But if I bring in those minis I showed before, they definitely fit in, but again, we have dye lot differences because we do have a technique at first where the dyes strike really quickly and a little unevenly for making our tonals. But then we also had a technique where we're randomly applying the speckles, and so the order and everything would change from batch to batch. And so I don't think that there's like an extreme difference from those, I guess, 11th minis I added in each row, but maybe there are some subtle differences. My point in all of this dye lot conversation is that for while this is a lovely, subtle overall technique, if you wanted to dye a sweater's quantity of this yarn, I would potentially want to dye more yarn than I thought would be required and then pick out skeins that felt like they were the most similar. Or, alternatively, I would dye up the yarn and then try to arrange it in like the most subtle fade ever, where skeins that have the least amount of darkness would be maybe towards the bottom, and skeins with the most lightness would be up towards the shoulders. Just so that way, at least then when you alternate skeins every couple of rounds as you're switching them, then at least there is something that feels, I guess, a little more intentional. But otherwise, you could have things that sort of fade, not quite striped, but lighter and a little bit darker. And it might just add to a randomness to a non-repeating type of colorway. And hopefully non-pooling too. Our yarn mops today are at the same time both fairly different from the main colorway, but also quite different from one another. Because here we have almost no purple at all. We do have little red speckles from the leftover delphinium blue, but we don't have any of the, I think it was lilac that I used as the main color in this skein whatsoever. Whereas we have a lot of the purple here, and because I was using this to wipe up the counter and things, it's funny, the delphinium blue almost disappears completely, but we feel a lot of the greens and the browns as subtle notes in here, and I actually love this combination. Okay, you can see the blue. It's just very, very, very subtle because it blends in a little bit more with that purple. There's a little bit less contrast. Now that we have 50 mini skeins here, you can get a little bit more of a sense of all of the different colors that we have. And yeah, again, there are some that are much lighter, some that are a little darker, but overall, I feel like I did a fairly consistent job, and so I'm very happy. I mean, depending on the technique, it can be hard to achieve consistency, so it's not necessarily something to like pat yourself on the back for or not, but I think one of the things that's useful about this series is to look at the mini skeins and see how similar are they to one another, because that can help give you a feel about how consistent one batch might be to another and things like that. This just has me itching to dye a lot more tonals, and not even going for more of a semi-solid, but more just legit tonals. I just absolutely love them, and I love the subtle speckles that when I'm standing up further away than the camera is, I see all those colors really clearly. I don't know how well they're coming through on the little monitor, but I just love the subtlety of them, and I hope you do too. Sometimes I love to create bright, wild colorways, and other times I like to go for something a little bit more subtle, and that's what we ended up with tonight. Dharma's Lilac Acid Dye is a color that I really have underutilized up to this point, and I have a feeling I will be pulling it out of my stash more in the future to play with it in other videos. Now, tonight is the 8th night of Chanukah, but our celebration doesn't end at sundown. There will be 3 more videos in this year's special, 2 bonus full skein yarn dyeing videos, and then a vlog, which will showcase all of the yarn we dyed in this Chanukah special, plus it'll also take you behind the scenes, the extras I made for the samplers, my thoughts along the process, and more. So make sure you stay tuned. Those videos will be coming out over the next 3 nights at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Of course, you can subscribe and turn on your notifications so that way YouTube can let you know about 30 minutes before the premiere begins. And seriously, if you haven't subscribed already, what are you waiting for? I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and I really hope you have enjoyed tonight's video. Happy Chanukah, and I'll see you tomorrow night!